Welcome to Talk Treatises. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating classic text.
A text that sits right at the intersection of biography, art criticism, and honestly, deep theology.
Exactly. We have a mission today to explore one of those singular minds in human history. And the text we're analyzing today tries to unpack what it calls a problematic nature.
Singular is definitely the right word. I mean, we are talking about a man who didn't just break the mold, and he never even acknowledged that the mold existed in the first place.
Right. But before we get to the man himself and the deep theological tradition he influenced, I want to transport you back to a very specific date. I want you to picture it. November 28th, 1757.
A very specific date and a very specific atmosphere. We're in London. It's the mid-18th century.
Now, to the average person walking the streets of London on that day, you know, maybe dodging the mud, avoiding the horse carts, it was just another Monday.
Business as usual.
Exactly. The 7 Years' War was raging in the background. Politics were happening. People were buying and selling. But if you were a follower of the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, this was the day. The big one.
Right, because the year 1757 was the exact year Swedenborg announced as the Last Judgment.
But we should probably clarify what he meant by that immediately because, well, it sounds terrifying.
It does. But he didn't mean the fire and brimstone, end of the world judgment that most people think of. The sky didn't turn red. The earth didn't crack open.
Right. No zombies rising from the graves.
Exactly. No zombies. Swedenborg meant a purely spiritual Last Judgment. His claim was that the world continued on externally, business as usual, but something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual realm.
Like the tectonic plates of the soul had moved.
That's a great way to put it. The old order was gone, and a new spiritual era had begun. Invisible to the naked eye, but absolutely real nonetheless.
And the irony here, which is honestly just too perfect to be fiction, is that on this very day, while the world supposedly didn't end but changed spiritually, a baby was born in Broad Street, Golden Square, London.
A baby who would spend his entire life seeing that exact spiritual world overlaying the physical one.
A baby who would grow up to act as if that spiritual shift was the only thing that actually mattered. We are talking, of course, about William Blake.
The man, the myth, as our text today categorizes him, the problematic nature.
Right. We're diving deep into the life, the art, and the absolutely wild theological mind of William Blake, all through the lens of this classic biographical treatise.
Which is an interesting vantage point in itself, because the author of our text is looking back at a man who is almost completely misunderstood in his own time.
All right, completely.
The author is writing for an audience that values order, progress, and rationality. And he's trying to explain a man who was basically pure chaos in spirit.
And the text doesn't pull any punches either. It calls Blake a problematic nature right from the jump. It talks about his abnormal visionary faculty.
It's a great phrase, isn't it? Abnormal visionary faculty.
It sounds almost like a medical diagnosis. Like, I'm sorry, Mr. Blake, the test came back and you have a severe case of abnormal visionary faculty.
In a way, the author's using it as a diagnosis. He's really trying to grapple with the central paradox of Blake. Here's a man who died singing songs to his maker, who's buried in a common grave, Bun Hill Fields, with no monument for a long time, and who lived his entire life on pennies.
By all capitalist metrics, an absolute failure.
Right. And yet today, the little scraps of paper he drew on are worth fortunes. He's a titan of Western thought and culture.
And the text makes this point right up front. Blake is totally unique in cultural history. We have great painters who wrote a little poetry. I mean, Michelangelo wrote some beautiful sonnets.
Rossetti wrote poems.
Sure. We have great poets who can sketch a bit too. Victor Hugo was a decent draftsman. But Blake
is the only one where the two are perfectly equal. You cannot understand Blake the poet without Blake the painter.
They aren't just hobbies to each other.
No, they are completely fused. The text says he's the only artist who defiantly discarded all purpose from his work except spiritual suggestiveness.
So our mission today is to unpack this problematic nature. We're going to look at the man who walked down a London street and literally saw a tree full of angels. We're going to look at how he practically invented his own method of printing because he was too poor to pay a publisher.
And we're going to ask the big question our source text wrestles with. Was he mad? Or was he seeing something the rest of us are just blind to?
It's a question that defines his whole legacy. So let's start at the beginning. The child is father to the man, as the saying goes.
And what a child. I mean, usually when a kid has an imaginary friend, you play along, you set an extra place at the dinner table. But Blake Blake had incidents.
Incidents is putting it mildly. These were full-blown confrontations with the divine. The text details this one story that honestly gave me chills. Blake is 4 years old. 4. And he looks out the window of his house and he just starts screaming.
Right.
Why? Because he says God put his forehead to the window.
Imagine the intensity of that for a 4-year-old. Not a cloud that looked like God, but a face pressing against the glass. It really sets the tone for his entire life. For Blake, the divine wasn't up there in the sky, remote and abstract.
Right, it wasn't some distant theological concept.
No, it was right here, pressing against the window pane of a house in Soho. It was immediate, invasive, and terrifying.
And then, a few years later, he's maybe 8 or 10 years old, and he's walking at Peckham Rye, just a normal park, and he looks up at a tree.
And this is one of the most famous anecdotes in his biography. He sees a tree filled with angels. The text describes it beautifully, bright, angelic wings bespangling the boughs like stars.
And he goes home and tells his dad.
And his dad, being a sensible Hojer, a man who sold socks and stockings for a living, probably wants to thrash the lying right out of him.
Because in that era, a kid making up stories wasn't considered creative.
Exactly, he was just a liar. But this is where the text makes a really crucial distinction about his place in the theological tradition. It says for Blake, these weren't metaphors. He wasn't saying the tree is like a choir of angels. He was saying, I see angels.
That distinction is everything, isn't it?
It really is. The author classifies artists into 3 distinct groups. You have the realists, those who see the world as solid reality and try to copy it. You have the idealists, those who see the world as a hieroglyphic or a symbol of something else. And then you have those who are both.
And Blake is the hieroglyphic guy.
He's the supreme visionary. He sees the material world as a mere hieroglyphic of a spiritual reality. To him, the tree is just a symbol. The angels are the actual reality. The wood and the leaves are just the screen that the angels are projected into.
It's so interesting that despite this wild imagination, his education was actually very well grounded, or at least grounded in stone. He gets apprenticed to an engraver named Bazare.
Yes, at age 14. And this is pivotal. Bazire wasn't some fashionable high society artist. He was an engraver of antiquities. He was the guy you hired to draw old vases and crumbling walls. So he sends young Blake to Westminster Abbey.
To draw the tombs.
Exactly. Imagine this teenage boy locked in Westminster Abbey, often completely alone, climbing up on the effigies of dead kings and queens to sketch them from every angle, spending his days with the dead.
The text calls it a lonely temple. The height, the space, the gloom, the glory.
It completely rewired his brain. The author argues this imbued Blake with the Gothic spirit. In the 18th century, the fashionable taste was pseudo-classic, smooth, rational, Greek, Roman.
Think of white marble and perfect symmetry.
Right. But Blake falls in love with the Gothic, the rigid, the spiritual, the heavily ornamental. He started seeing those stone heads as portraits of living people. He saw the ornaments as literal miracles.
So while everyone else is trying to paint like Raphael and be very polite and classical, Blake is drawing his theology from dead medieval kings.
Precisely. It isolated him. It made him a man out of time before he even really started his career. The text mentions his earliest engraving, Joseph of Arimathea. Blake claimed he copied it from a print by Michelangelo.
Though the author doubts that attribution, right?
Yeah, he doubts it was actually Michelangelo, but the larger point remains. Blake was obsessed with the sublime from day one. He wanted art that felt like those tombs, heavy, spiritual, eternal.
Okay, so we have this Gothic, visionary teenager. He finishes his apprenticeship. He starts trying to make it as an artist in London. And then he meets a girl.
Ah, the courtship. It's a very Blakean romance. It's blunt and it's beautiful.
It starts with a rejection, doesn't it?
It does. He was enamored with a girl named Clara Woods. She turned him down flat. So Blake goes to recover at the home of a nursery gardener named Butcher in Battersea, and he meets the daughter, Catherine.
And the story goes that she pitied him.
She did. He told her all about his broken heart. She said she pitied him, and he just said, then I love you. And that was it.
Boom. Married.
Married in 1782. And our source spends some real time on Catherine because she is absolutely essential to his work. She was, by societal standards of the time, ignorant. She couldn't read or write when they met. She signed her marriage certificate with an X. Blake taught her everything.
He taught her to read.
To read, to write, and crucially for our story, to color his engravings. She became his full-time production assistant. But more than that, she became the anchor for his visionary life. The text describes her as helpmate in the truest sense. They were childless, so their children were these books and these grand visions. She would sit with him through the night while he drew.
And she actually believed him.
She believed in his spirits. That's the key to their whole dynamic. When he said, "I see a ghost," she didn't say, "William, take a rest." She sat there and kept him company while he drew it. The author calls it a perfect unity.
That unity becomes incredibly literal in how they made their work. Because this is the part that just blows my mind. The invention of illuminated printing. Blake wasn't just a writer who sent his manuscript off to a publisher to be typeset.
No, and this is where deep poverty meets absolute genius. Blake had these poems, what would eventually become Songs of Innocence, but he had zero money to pay a typesetter or a printer. He was completely stuck.
And then, true to form, he gets a solution directly from the spirit world.
From his dead brother, Robert. Robert had died young, and Blake had nursed him through his final illness. Blake claimed Robert's spirit appeared to him in a dream and revealed an entirely new technical printing process.
A DIY printing press from the afterlife.
Essentially, yes. And the text explains the process, which is actually quite technical and fascinating. Usually in standard engraving, you scratch lines into copper. Blake did the exact reverse. He used an impervious liquid, probably some kind of varnish, to write the text and draw the pictures directly onto the copper plate. Then he dipped the whole plate in acid.
So the acid eats away everything except what he painted with the varnish.
Right. It's called relief etching. The text and the image stand up like a rubber stamp. He could then ink that raised surface, printed in a single color, usually a yellowish brown, and then, and this is the magic part, he and Catherine would hand tint the pages with watercolors.
Glue-based watercolors.
Right.
The text mentions the glue specifically.
Yes, carpenter's glue diluted with water. It gave the colors a very specific, almost tactile texture. But think about the theological and artistic implication of this. The text points out that this made Blake the literal author of his books in every possible sense. He wrote the words. He designed the layout. He made the copper plates. He did the chemical etching. He did the printing. He did the binding. He did the coloring.
There is no middleman whatsoever. There is no editor telling him what to cut. It's pure, unfiltered Blake.
Which is why the author says art permeates the poetry. You can't separate them. If you read a Blake poem typed out in a standard modern textbook, you are only getting half the experience. You need to see the green sword where the text and the image are literally wrestling for space on the page.
Let's look at what he actually produced with this method. We start with Songs of Innocence in 1789.
The vibe here is, as the text puts it, caressing tenderness. It's lambs, nursemaids, playing children.
But it's not just cute, is it?
No, not at all. The author calls it the innocent courage of the infant. You know how a baby will reach out and touch a snake because it just doesn't know it should be afraid? That's the exact energy of Songs of Innocence. It's a vision of the world before the fall.
And then 5 years later, in 1794, we get the companion volume, Songs of Experience. And the mood, well, it shifts.
Drastically. If Innocence is the baby touching the snake, Experience is the realization that the snake bites. It's full of heavy metaphysical questioning. And the centerpiece, the one poem everyone knows, is the tiger.
Tiger, tiger, burning bright.
The text dives really deep into this one. It connects it directly to the biblical book of Job. The central question of the poem is, did he who made the lamb make thee?
It's a huge theological question. Did the exact same God who made the fluffy little lamb also design this terrifying killing machine?
Exactly. The author suggests Blake is asking if the creator smiled to see his work when he made a monster. It touches on this Gnostic idea, which we really need to get into, that maybe the God who created the physical world with all its violence and suffering isn't the ultimate good God.
It's the problematic nature coming out again. He's not just writing pretty rhymes. He's challenging the fundamental nature of creation.
And the irony of all this, these masterpieces, these handmade, illuminated books that are now considered priceless treasures of human civilization, the text notes they sold for 30 shillings. Maybe 2 guineas if you were really lucky.
And Blake felt rich anyway.
He did. He and Catherine subsisted on absolute pennies, but because he was living entirely in this world of visions, he felt like a king.
But then things get weird.
Weirder.
The prophetic books.
Yeah. We move from the tiger, which is punchy and rhymes and makes immediate sense, to stuff like Thel, Urizen, Europe, Jerusalem. And the author of our text, he really struggles with these. He does. And honestly, most readers do. The argument the text makes is that as Blake's artistic faculty grew, his poetic form dissolved. He abandoned meter and rhyme for what Blake called monotonous cadence. Blake claimed this free verse was spiritually superior, but our author is pretty savage about it.
What does he say?
He calls the work a gigantic arabesque. He says reading it is like watching a procession of banners. It's impressive, it's colorful, it's grand, but you can't distinguish the individual faces. It's just a blur of giants and spirits and shouting.
And the names, Urizen, Los, Enitharmon, it sounds like a complex sci-fi novel.
It is a full cosmology. And the text makes a really fascinating theological connection here. It says Blake heavily resembles the ancient Gnostics.
Can we pause and unpack Gnostic? Because that's a heavy term, and it's central to his worldview.
Sure. Gnosticism was an early religious movement peaking around the 2nd century that competed with Orthodox Christianity. They had a few key ideas that our text sees directly mirrored in Blake. First, they believed that the material world nature was inherently bad. It wasn't created by the true transcendent God, but by a lesser, flawed, sometimes malevolent deity. They often called this creator the demiurge.
So trees, rocks, human bodies, all bad.
Or at least a trap, a prison for the divine spirit. Blake once actually told Wordsworth that nature is the work of the devil.
Wow. And Wordsworth is the guy who famously wrote poems about wandering lonely as a cloud and looking at daffodils. That must have gone over really well.
Right. So Blake and the Gnostics share this intense disparagement of nature. Second, they both have these elaborate cosmogonies with made-up names for various emanations and spirits, right? And third, they believe in salvation through knowledge, which is what gnosis means, rather than just through moral virtue.
Salvation through intellect and vision over being a quote-unquote good person.
The text quotes Blake directly on this. He said, "The fool shall not enter into heaven, let him be ever so holy." That is a profoundly Gnostic sentiment. It's not enough to just follow the rules and be polite. You have to know. You have to actively see the spiritual reality.
But even though our author thinks the poetry in these later books becomes a tangled mess, he absolutely defends the visuals.
Completely. He says the text might be nearly impossible to read, but the visuals are purely sublime. He specifically mentions the image of the Ancient of Days.
That's the famous image, right? The old man with the white beard leaning down out of the sun.
Yes, reaching down with a massive compass to measure the earth. It's iconic. The text calls it a mix of the sublime and the grotesque. It's Blake showing the creator who he calls Urizen, binding the infinite into a finite, measurable world. It's terrifying, but it's beautiful.
So Blake is deep in his own world, making these wild prophetic books. But he still needs to eat. And this leads us to what I like to call the sitcom season of Blake's life.
The Felpham period.
Yes. So Blake moves to the countryside, down to Sussex, to work for a man named William Haley.
And you really couldn't pick two more fundamentally different people. Haley was a polite dilettante. He was a bad poet, but very popular and very wealthy. He wanted Blake to just be a standard commercial engraver. He wanted him to paint little miniatures and illustrate his frankly terrible ballads.
So you have Blake, who's literally talking to the prophet Ezekiel on the beach, and Haley is like, "That's nice, William, but can you draw a cat for my new poem?"
Exactly. The text calls Haley the representative of gentle ignorance. He was kind. That's almost the worst part. He was genuinely trying to help Blake make a living. But he was trying to turn a fiery prophet into a polite commercial artist.
Blake didn't take it well, I assume.
No, he didn't. He wrote letters complaining that polite disapprobation was killing him. He felt his visionary faculty was being smothered by the fresh country air and all these polite tea parties.
But the most dramatic moment in Felpham wasn't even about art. It was about a soldier.
The sedition trial. This is a crazy story. Blake finds a soldier in his garden one day. We don't know exactly why he was there, maybe just lost or loitering. Blake, who is a fiery little guy, just kicks him out, physically marches him down the road.
And the soldier doesn't like that.
No, he doesn't. So the soldier accuses Blake of sedition. He claims Blake damned a king.
Which was a hanging offense back then, or at least a severe prison sentence.
It was incredibly serious. Damn the king and all his soldiers was the alleged quote. Blake had to stand trial, and here's the twist. Haley, the polite dilettante, who Blake couldn't stand working for, stepped up. He paid for the defense, he supported Blake in court, and Blake was acquitted.
There's a great visual detail the text mentions from the trial. An old man who was there in the courtroom remembered nothing about the arguments, but he clearly remembered Blake's flashing eye.
That intensity, it just burned into people's memories.
So Blake leaves Felpham, comes back to London, probably very happy to be away from the cows and the polite poets, but he's still poor, and he falls in with a completely new crowd.
The ancients. A group of young artists, guys like John Linnell and Samuel Palmer, who really looked up to him as a master. But the most entertaining character from this late period is definitely John Varley.
Varley the astrologer.
Yes. The text describes Varley as a man who believed in the zodiac, cast horoscopes for everyone, but saw absolutely nothing himself. He had zero visionary power of his own, so he was utterly fascinated by Blake. He used Blake as a kind of spiritual camera.
A spiritual camera. How does that work?
They would sit up late at night together. Varley would say, I want to see William Wallace, or show me the builder of the pyramids. And Blake would just say, okay, I see him. And he would start drawing.
Just like that. I see him.
Instantly. These are known as the visionary heads. And the most famous story from these sessions, and our author loves this one, is the ghost of a flea.
Please tell me about the flea.
So Varley asks to see the ghost of a flea. Blake starts drawing this monstrous, scaly, almost vampire-like head, and then suddenly he stops. He just puts his pencil down.
Why? Did he lose the vision?
Varley asks him, why did you stop? And Blake says, the ghost has opened its mouth.
He had to wait for the ghost to close its mouth.
Yes. He couldn't finish the intricate lip detail until the sitter closed its mouth. The text points this out as absolute proof of how literal this process was for Blake. He wasn't just imagining a flea in his mind's eye, he was copying what he actually saw in the room. If the vision moved, he had to stop and wait.
That is fantastic, and a little terrifying.
The author notes that Varley was totally convinced. He watched Blake's process and said, this man is seeing something I simply can't.
So we're coming into the final stretch of Blake's life here, and you might think, with old age, extreme poverty, whispers of madness, his work would decline. But the text argues the exact opposite.
It argues that Blake's final major work, the illustrations of the Book of Job, is his absolute peak. It's the perfect balance of his faculties.
Why Job, specifically?
It fits Blake perfectly from a theological standpoint. Job is the man who faithfully follows God, but is brutally punished anyway. He's totally misunderstood by his friends. Blake likely saw a lot of himself in Job. Suffering, poor, but fiercely faithful to his own vision.
And the art itself.
It's much less chaotic than the prophetic books. It's incredibly disciplined. The engraving technique is superb. The text mentions specific images, the morning stars singing together, and the representation of God. This isn't the tender, gentle Jesus of songs of innocence. This is an awful, monotheistic, Hebraic force. It's incredibly powerful stuff.
He also did illustrations for Blair's poem, The Grave,
which was actually a rare commercial success for him, mostly thanks to a wily publisher named Chromac, who kind of stiffed Blake on the deal, but that's a whole other story. The key image from that series is Death's Door. It shows an old man tottering into a dark tomb and a vibrant young man rising out of the top of it. It perfectly captures Blake's belief that death is literally just a room you walk through.
And finally, Dante. Blake decides to illustrate the Divine Comedy.
At age 65. And he decides he needs to learn Italian to do it properly, so he just learns Italian.
That is serious dedication.
But he didn't actually agree with Dante's theology.
He didn't.
No. Blake's main critique was, Dante saw devils where I see none. Blake didn't believe in the eternal, retributive punishment of hell in the way Dante depicted it. He thought Dante was far too vengeful. Even in his old age, Blake was fighting with his source materials, correcting them based on his own visions.
So we reached the very end. August 12th, 1827. The death scene.
It's honestly one of the most moving death scenes in any artist's biography. He's working in bed on a colored version of The Ancient of Days. He finishes it. He turns to his wife. Catherine, remember, she's been with him through all the crushing poverty, all the midnight visions, and he says, "You have ever been an angel to me." He draws her portrait one last time. And then as he lay dying, he burst into song. He sang songs of triumph to his maker. He didn't die in fear or in pain. He died completely ecstatic. He was finally going to the place he'd been watching through the window his entire life.
And the text's final take. After reviewing all of this, the angels, the fleas, the prophetic poems, the prince.
The author comes back to that phrase, the problematic nature. He concludes that Blake had delusions. He confused fancy with fact. But he absolutely refuses to call him insane.
What's the distinction there?
The distinction is highly functional. Blake was a good citizen. He was a devoted husband. He was socially capable when he needed to be. He didn't let his visions ruin his life or hurt other people. The text says he didn't question his corporeal eye. He simply looked through it, not with it.
I looked through it, not with it. That is the key phrase of his whole philosophy.
To Blake, the sun wasn't just a guinea-sized golden disk in the sky. He explicitly said, "Oh, no, I see an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, 'Holy, holy, holy.'" The author says Blake reveals possibilities in art and poetry we wouldn't have even suspected without him. He was a man without a mess.
It is a beautiful way to put it. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, we always like to take the ideas we've discussed and push them just a little bit further. We call these our thought experiments.
Let's do it. Disclaimer, of course, that these are purely hypothetical scenarios inspired by Blake's worldview, just for educational entertainment.
Right. So thought experiment number 1.
Okay.
Let's call it the augmented reality of the soul. Blake claimed everyone possesses this visionary faculty, but in most of us, it's torpid. It's asleep. Imagine we develop a future technology, let's say a Neuralink filter or advanced AR glasses, that doesn't add data to the world, but subtracts the filter of the corporeal eye. It tunes our brain entirely to Blake mode.
Okay, so you put on these glasses, and instead of seeing a brick building, you see the spiritual form of the building.
Exactly. If we looked at New York City or London today through Blake mode, what would we actually see? Blake saw London as a giant man, a spiritual entity in pain.
It really tests that Gnostic idea we talked about. Is the material world just a screen hiding the real action? If you walked into Wall Street with Blake glasses on, would you see men in tailored suits? Or would you see, as Blake put it, the tigers of wrath? Would you see demons of greed and angels of charity literally fighting in the streets?
It would make a morning commute absolutely terrifying.
But also, maybe much more honest. If Blake is right, the spiritual form is the actual truth, and the physical form is the lie. Maybe we're the ones wearing the blindfolds right now.
Thought experiment number 2, the moral inversion of the sent man. Blake had this incredibly provocative theological idea. He said, what are called vices in the natural world are the highest sublimities in the spiritual world. He loved energy. He hated restraint. He associated restraint with Urizen, the boring, rule-making god.
Right. He wrote, the tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction.
So apply this to a modern legal or ethical system. Imagine a society where energy is the only recognized virtue and restraint is the only crime.
That's fascinating. So in a court of law, the criminal would be the bureaucrat, the person who stifles creativity.
Exactly. The person who says, no, you can't build that, or fill out this form in triplicate. They are the sinner because they are blocking the divine flow of energy. The person who acts on pure impulse, even disruptive impulse, might be seen as holy because they are expressing energy.
It's his text, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, applied directly to civic life. It completely challenges our definition of good as passive obedience. We tend to think a good person is someone who follows the rules and stays quiet. Blake says, no, that's death, that's Urizen. A good person is a burning fire. It would be a wildly chaotic society, but it certainly wouldn't be stagnant.
It makes you look at the disruptors of our world a little differently. Maybe they're just channeling a little bit of that Blakean chaos.
It certainly gives a lot of context to the problematic nature of genius.
So where does this leave us with William Blake and his place in our tradition?
I think we have to go back to that final image of him, dying, singing. Here is a man who willingly bought his own poverty as the price for his vision. He could have been a rich, polite engraver. He could have painted nice little miniatures for Haley. But he chose the angels.
He made the trade.
He did. The text calls him the parallel column of art. There's the main army of artists, Raphael, Reynolds, the people who follow the rules and march in a straight line. And then, walking on a side road, completely by himself, is Blake. And the funny thing is, the main army marches on and is eventually forgotten, but the man on the side road ends up ahead of them all.
So, here is our final call to you, the listener. The next time you see a sunrise, don't just check your phone for the weather, look at it. Try, just for a second, to see the choir of angels instead of just a disc of fire. Try to look through the eye, not with it.
And if you happen to see a ghost of a flea, maybe wait for it to close its mouth before you try to draw it.
Sound advice. Thanks for deep diving with us today on Talk Treatises. We'll see you in the spiritual world next time.